Agenda items 4, 5 and 6 recorded by Hansard. Agreed.
Agreed.
Apologies from Martin and Dominic. Any other apologies?
Ian McRae.
Agree. Draft minutes, pages 5 to 10. Members content they're an accurate record. Agreed. Okay, can I refer members to a draft motion for plenary debate on the committee report on its review of sickness absence in the public sector, pages 13 to 16 for noting. Can I seek agreement to lay the motion as drafted?
Great. Chair, the debate's likely to be after Easter, so the report will be embargoed obviously until the debate, and probably electronic copies of the report will be made available.
Okay, can I also seek agreement to copy the committee's report to statutory committees, PAC and the Audit Office on an embargo basis? Agreed. Table requests for information from the DFP at pages 13 to 15 for noting. Moving on to the DFP draft business plan. Can I refer members to their papers at pages 17 to 23 of your packs? Morning.
Morning, Chair.
Hey. Okay, Dave, do you want to make some opening comments on the draft business plan, and then we'll move to questions?
Yeah, I don't want to say very much. Just obviously,
Never do.
you've got our. You've got our. Do I take that as a compliment? You've got our targets here. These are still a draft. There's two main reasons for that. Obviously, we are still waiting decisions about the roll forward of the programme for government into 15-16. And then obviously there are some areas where, excuse me, traditionally, we can't set targets really until we get the end year figures, and that's things like rate, the amount of the rate collection target and the debt recovery target. So you've really just got the raw targets. I don't envisage there to be any additional targets coming out of the roll forward of the programme for government, but this is where we are as of today. So,
Okay. Are they more ambitious than last year's, or how do we know these are challenging for the department?
we've got fewer targets, and that really reflects that we're, I suppose, coming to the end of a corporate plan period, so some things have already been done. We've also tried to reduce so that we've got a set of more strategic targets. And yes, certainly these are stretching. Some, as I say, in and around, for example, rate collection, debt recovery. You know, the Minister obviously will finalise these targets, and I know he is always keen to set stretching, demanding targets in those areas. So, yeah, but happy to take members' comments on the extent to which they think they're stretching enough.
In terms of our 1.9, page 18, BFG commitment on community benefits, including social clauses, and the target is to monitor the implementation of the executive's policy and social clauses. Now, obviously, this is an issue that has been raised with the committee on a number of occasions. How could we make that more challenging, given that there has been weaknesses in the monitoring and reporting arrangements to date?
Well, I think, as you know, SIB have been engaged to do a review of social clauses, and you know, we'd expect that review will indeed not just comment on the substantive point about social clauses, but will also comment on the way in which they can best be monitored effectively. So, you know, this is something that we in CPD are keen to see the outcome of that report and to see what we can learn for the future.
When does this have to be signed off for?
So I just don't have that. I'll let you know that. Yeah.
You're talking about the next couple of weeks?
I think the review is underway. I know it's. Oh, sorry. The plan itself.
Yeah.
We're keen to get the plan signed off as soon as possible. It's probably going to run into the new financial year.
We would normally have it signed off around about the end of April, because we need to see obviously what the performance is on the rates collection side before we set next year's targets, to make sure that those targets are stretching enough. Because if we were to set a target now based on what we think the year-end outcome might be, we might not be setting a stretching enough target, I suppose. So We would normally aim to have the plan signed off by the end of April.
So by then we should have, in terms of our 1.10, a more specific target for the rates income collected.
Yes.
Moving on to page 20. Is there any plans to include anything in regard to flexi working? I mean, obviously, you're talking about the reduction in terms of the office estate, but we've also learned that there's proposals being put in place, I think, for Oma and Derry for more stations for flexible working. Is that something that should be in here, or is that something you could consider in the next couple of weeks?
It's something we could consider. I don't think we don't have a specific target at the moment. Obviously, we're preoccupied at the moment with implementing the voluntary exit scheme, and then obviously we're going to have to address the fairly substantial redeployment that's going to go alongside that. So obviously there'll need to be an element of workforce planning to make all that work. So that's the sort of thing that we could certainly consider
Everyone's
within
pretty
that.
fluid at the moment. Is that
Sorry?
what the difficulty is in terms of a lot of the target setting?
Yes, there's no doubt we're going to see considerable movement across the civil service. You know, as like if the scheme is successful, you know, 2,400 odd people will leave, but they won't be in the jobs that are lowest priority jobs. So, you know, there's going to have to be a lot of movement of people, not just within departments, but maybe even across departments as well. So that, you know, this is going to be a big challenge for the civil service, and I know that.
Could you give us a brief update on how things are going?
The applications as of the end of last week, I think it was reported in the media, were over 3,500. So I haven't got a more up-to-date figure than that.
So that was just on the opening day, was it? Or
No, that was at the end of the week.
Fairly fast.
Yeah.
It only opened last Monday. It seems a lot
Can you get
longer.
hands up if who actually wants to stay?
But those are only surely really wanting details, aren't they?
Sorry?
They're really only asking for the details.
Details enough from it.
No, it's a bit more than that. It's an expression of interest. When you actually go into the screen, you're asked to indicate whether you intend to apply or not apply. So it's more than just, I'm curious, tell me a bit more about this. It's
How much more information do you get then when you say okay?
Well, basically, if you express an interest, you're effectively indicating that you will be applying, and you then have to fill in the application form and submit that before the end of the month.
You don't have to apply.
No, but you can speculate as to the motives of those who have expressed an interest and said they're going to apply. There will probably not be 100% conversion, but, you know, I think we would expect there will be a very high conversion rate. You know, in other words, we would expect most of those that have expressed an interest in applying, they will apply.
That would really meet your target then for year one, wouldn't it?
It would mean we would have sufficient, yes.
I think we'll watch this.
Indeed.
In terms of the office estate then, hasn't yet been decided what the target is, but can you give us an indication what range that would be in terms of vacation?
I think it was around 2,500 they were thinking of, but we've still to obviously agree that with the business area and also to put that to the Minister for agreement. So I wouldn't really want to have that quoted as an actual amount.
And how many square metres did we vacate last year?
And I don't have that figure to hand, unfortunately.
No, sorry, I should have had that too.
Yeah.
Roughly?
I'm sorry, I know it was about 400 workstations, I think, but no, it
Well, I'm
was
trying
more
to
than
get
that,
at
sorry.
is the target in terms of 2,500 this year more challenging than last year's?
I think it would be helpful if we could write to you on that.
Yeah,
if that,
okay.
If that would
Yeah, obviously, we haven't got the year's out turners yet, so, and I know that a lot of things were happening late in the year.
In terms of the target for pay bill savings of 26 million, how does that break down for DFP specifically?
We're looking to reduce DFP numbers by 300.
It's about we're working on staff leaving on an average at the end of December, because we know the tranches are between September and March. So we're working on an average of people leaving at the end of December, and we're targeting around about £2.5 million for DFP.
But obviously that's not a full year cost.
That's just the final 3 months, so that would then give us a £10 million reduction in subsequent years.
So that's out of a DFP staff complement of how many?
About 3,500.
And are other departments setting similar targets, or should they be? And there,
It varies a little bit, but by and large the percentage is about the same. When you take in the 2,500, the 2,400, plus the 1,000 that we expect to lose through suppression of vacancies and the moratorium on recruitment, that'll lead to about a 10% reduction overall, or more than a 10% reduction actually.
in terms of sickness absence on page 23 for members, it was indicated to the committee last November that the department was on track to meet its individual departmental target of 7.6 days. Is that still the case, and why is the same target in again? Should we not be putting something more challenging down there?
The latest figures I recall suggest that we may still hit it, but there's a risk we won't. Obviously we're coming through the sort of 2 or 3 months of the year where we tend to have the highest level of sickness. We're close to target. We're still, I think, the best or the second best performing department across the NICS. At the NICS level, we're not expecting to meet the target, but we still hope DFP will meet the target. Because we're at a point where it's very fine margin, the target for next year, I think, is mainly is to hit the same target.
Yeah. And that's sort of cascading down from what we expect the PFG target to be, which would be to maintain the level rather than to target a further reduction.
In terms of the strategy for the next year, what actions are proposed to ensure that that number stays down? Is there any initiatives departments going to undertake?
Well, we're pressing hard on departments to ensure there's compliance with various absence management procedures, particularly return to work interviews. We know that if people conduct return to work interviews after somebody's been absent, it does improve the position. So at an NICS level,
Why is that?
I think it just, well, I suppose there's a variety of things happen, you know. It allows line managers to get a better understanding of the particular issues affecting the member of staff. It means that if there is some underlying cause, there's a better chance you can find a way of addressing that. In discussion with the individual, maybe there needs to be a referral to the occupational health service, the welfare services. There may need to be some particular adjustments for the individual. You can't establish those things unless you've got engagement between the employee and the line manager. So that we know that does work. And we're going to, at an NICS level, we're going to monitor that across departments so that you know, there's a bit of naming and shaming. And we have seen in other areas how league tables can actually improve performance in terms of improving compliance. But there's no other major initiatives.
Is there a flip side to that as well in terms of putting pressure on staff?
It's not intended to put pressure on staff. I think I would just say it's good management practice. If somebody's been off, as I say, it is a requirement that the line manager has a discussion with that person. It doesn't have to be adversarial or confrontational. It's really just establishing, you know, is there anything that can be done? Is there a pattern? Are there things that we need to address? And it does make a difference. As I say, just good management.
And in terms of flexible working, is there any strategies in regard to that tie in with the sickness targets?
There's no new initiatives in that regard underway at the moment. As I say, we're focusing very much on just managing the upheaval we're going to face with voluntary exit, etc. But we will be looking at things that help us, you know, just manage the process.
See, in terms of just the profile of DAP staff, I mean, how many would you have on your West Rones, your Derry, your Fermanagh that are driving into Belfast each and every day?
I don't know I could answer that.
No, I don't know whether that data would be available.
We'll see if we can find out. But obviously, there are people who'd be interested in working in the Northwest. Like we know that when DARD invited expressions of interest to, when they asked who would be interested in working in Ballykelly, I think they got over 1,500 expressions of interest from across the NICS. But I don't know how many people would drive that sort of distance to work in Belfast and DFP.
And I'm just trying to get a sense of what staff are going to be based in the new stations. We got correspondence a couple of weeks ago from the department saying Omagh and what other areas, Cookstown and Newry is going to be considered in the future, as well as Ballykelly. So obviously the department
This is a DARD, yeah.
But not DFP.
DFP.
Presumably that may be DFP taking initiative on behalf of the service as a whole.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't necessarily be just DFP staff maybe who are availing of that. I mean, I have an idea of how many of my staff would be travelling that kind of distance, but that's obviously a very small percentage of the department as a whole. I mean, I know I've got someone who travels up from Newry into Stormont Estate every day, and I have somebody who travels up from Omagh. But
Do they travel 5 days a week?
it varies because they're both in our internal audit unit, so they would occasionally be undertaking audits that are in different locations.
Okay, Leslie?
Just really sort of a same area, really. You have a target there on our page 20, with this well-being promoting staff health. And if you relate that to what we've just been speaking there about the sickness absence, we know that roughly a third of that's due to mental health. Is that not a little bit sort of slow, really, to talk about a whole year, really, to promote this programme across the state? Not be some urgency, particularly in those areas where we know that people have mental health problems?
Well, I think the well-being programme is really directed at the whole of the NICS. But if anybody has particular issues, then they can be addressed through referrals to the OHS. And again, going back to the point I made earlier, if somebody has a pattern of absence and it's clear that mental health issues are one of the underlying factors, then I would expect that there would be an early referral to the OHS. And indeed, I'm fairly sure that if somebody indicates when they go off sick and they're off sick for more than, I think it might be 7 days, I can check the exact figures, there's an automatic referral to the OHS if mental health issues are the cause of the absence. So we are particularly active in that.
That would have been happening anyway, wouldn't it? That would have been the normal operandi. And we still have a third of the people have anxiety, stress, depression.
Yes. Although, again, I can't give you exact numbers of this, but a significant amount of the mental health, anxiety, stress issues are not work-related. It would be wrong to assume that if you see mental health, anxiety, stress issues as a cause of absence, that it's due to work pressures. That is not the case. It could be. Yes, it could be.
And again, David, with the trauma that's ahead of you here, if you lose all these staff people, that's bound to increase the pressures on the remaining staff.
Yeah, we're alive to that. And
can we ramp up this well-being sort of programme rather than let it drift for a whole year? Could not more emphasis be put on it now?
Well, we're certainly we're taking steps to ensure that we don't cut back on our welfare services or well-being because of the upheaval that we're going to face over the next year. And we're very clear that the permanent secretaries have agreed that we need to ensure that those support mechanisms are available for staff. But it's going to be equally important that all staff in a leadership role, and that's right down to the executive officer level, are sensitive to the issues that are going to be facing people over the next year. Now we know we've talked in recent times to I was over in Scotland recently. We talked about how they manage this there. I met people from Birmingham City Council recently and been talking to people in Whitehall departments. So we've picked up on some of the things, some of the lessons that they've learned while they've been downsizing as well. And one of the messages that comes across is you need to continue to maintain these type of support services for staff, and we're seeking to do that.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Peter?
Yeah, no, just on a separate subject, on the issue, I mean, we touched on the rates collection side of it. Obviously, although it's not specified in terms of you're looking to increase sort of net cash collected, and obviously there's collection. Have you identified any additional initiatives in terms of the identification of properties? Because one of the issues in terms of rates side of it is, you know, if you like, a failure, if you like, where you've got some new properties that are on, that there's maybe at times been a bit of a slowness in terms of identifying them and rating them and charging them straight off. And I'm just wondering if you could talk through any particular initiatives you're working on that side of it.
Well, I know LPS are constantly looking to improve their procedures in this area and to maximise the amount that we collect. I don't have any detail of any specific initiative now, but certainly we can get that for you.
And I suppose the other interrelated issue, which again has been used from time to time on, I mean, appreciate LPS, you know, will be key at sort of targeting these things. I mean, what level of, is there any sort of thought towards enhanced cooperation with the councils? Because it strikes me that in terms of rate collection, that's always going to be an issue where you've got a double buy-in, because obviously, and indeed probably more so arguably from the councils than it will be for even LPS, because, you know, whatever we collect in and effectively is used as part of the regional rate, okay, it's one sense a reasonable chunk of money, but it's only a very, very small percentage of the overall budget. If you obviously increase the amount of money collected in, it can have a very dramatic impact because of the fact that, you know, that's really their source of income to councils in that regard. So there's quite a strong incentive for that level of cooperation. Again, at times down the years, I've seen a slightly sort of mixed level of cooperation, or the extent to how proactive LPS is on that subject.
Yeah, I suppose I'd make 2 points there. With RPA and the new councils coming in next month, I think LPS have been focusing on building relationships with the new councils, and there is an intention to continue to improve performance in this area. And I think LPS are sensitive to the fact that they were criticised quite heavily by councils in the past about performance, particularly in collecting business rates. The LPS have just in the last few weeks set about a sort of strategic review, and they're determined that, you know, looking ahead to 2020, they want to be a more agile organisation. They want to have better relationships with clients, customers, whatever way you describe the people they serve. And central to that will be better relationships with local government. So they're the early stages. They're in a sense where they are at the moment is they are defining where they want to be, but over the next few weeks and maybe even running into a few months, they'll be actually coming up with a programme which will be designed to address this.
I suppose, and this is always a certain level of delicate judgment balance. I suppose it's difficult to say precisely what is correct. But I mean, there's always either the opportunity, on the one hand, to, if you like, gradually build up the level of relationships, build up change on that regard by way of sort of incremental bit. I just wonder at times, sometimes, particularly if you're dealing with a situation that you've got, albeit in a lot of cases, the transfer of the same staff, a lot of functions being the same on it, that you have effectively 11 new entities, and whether there's almost a window of opportunity to make a complete degree of step change, rather than do something gradual, to move into a much clearer level of cooperation in that, and maybe that's an opportunity that, you know, while I appreciate there needs to be a level of evaluation, that we don't miss that opportunity in that.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I'm not ducking the question.
No, I understand that.
You know, it's they maybe won't thank me for this, but it might be worth asking LPS along at some stage just to explain how they're going to engage with the new councils, because I know they are working hard at it.
Okay, thank you.
John?
Thanks, Sharon. I suppose a few points just in your earlier parts. You both answered, Leslie, talked, around the mental health issues, and you used the word about upheaval with all the voluntary exit scheme. But the minute you've also an added bit of upheaval that you can't guarantee that it will actually happen, because we don't know. It's in your targets, to deliver the savings of 26 million. But at the minute you can't actually be certain that we're going to have agreement, or that the budget isn't blown wide open in a few months.
Indeed.
It sort of leaves even the other
There's
point.
much more I can say.
Well, fair point. Now, the other bit about Whitehall and downsizing, I mean, you're looking to reduce, say, by, 10%? Mm-hmm. I mean, had you roughly, I know it's a terrible phrase on natural wastage, but you roughly would have a natural wastage of about 3% per year. Would that be?
Yeah,
close enough to the mark?
we haven't obviously got figures for this year that's just ending, but the expectation is the numbers will be a lot lower.
I mean, had we actually started this a few years ago, you wouldn't have needed to be spending this level of money.
With hindsight, you could make that argument, but we've looked at what the Scots did. In recent times, I've talked to people who were in DCMS. They had to reduce by 50% while they were delivering the Olympics. Met recently with the Chief Executive of Birmingham City Council. They reduced from 20,000 down to 14,000. They're going to have to reduce by another few thousand. Met the Scots a couple of weeks ago. Met the Permanent Secretary of the Business Department. They had to reduce by 22% in a year. In all these areas, they faced with that drive to reduce costs quickly. They used a combination of things. They used suppression of vacancies, moratorium and recruitment. They used voluntary exit. So it was a combination of things. We're doing something similar. So,
but when they were doing it, Chair, I mean, looking at, I think it was the 2012 Audit Office report talked about when they were downsizing Whitehall departments, they took in performance and a range of issues. At the minute, our scheme, certainly in the first year, is very much hands up first, or who gets to the computer first and signs on. My concern even during budget debates around this and questioning the Minister has been about what happens if you end up with literally a brain drain from the civil service, that you cannot control who's going. You're not taking in performance or absenteeism or any of the bases that the Audit Office recommended a few years ago. And I mean, those places that you named, Birmingham, Edinburgh, Department of Business in London, are they not still working on that sort of Audit Office recommendations?
everybody has done it slightly differently, and the big driver for us is to cut cost quickly. And for that reason, the scheme is, has been scoped wide. Nobody's indispensable. If we were to put any additional requirements in, it would take longer, and it would take us longer to reduce the cost. It will be a big challenge for us from a management perspective, but I actually take the view that there's an opportunity here in that by doing something that's going to require a lot of people to be moved around, people are going to have to be retrained, but I think that will give us an opportunity to, in a sense, freshen things up. By moving people into new jobs where they're bringing the skills and experience they've gained in other areas and then being trained in a new area, I actually think there's an opportunity to do things differently and to do things better. So, and indeed that has been the experience of other people, is that they have got unexpected benefits in terms of just, as I say, freshening things up, moving people around. It does lead to a sort of, a growth in innovation.
And had any of them suffered any sorts of problems with literally moving people around and performance or frontline services, service delivery, and struggling to match the public's expectation.
Well, one of the messages we got actually is, there could be a temptation to, just cut all the back office services. But certainly the people in Birmingham said you need to be careful that you don't cut so far that actually you damage the front line, because the back office people are actually the ones that are allowing the frontline service deliverers to do their job. So we need to be careful about that as well.
Yeah, well, and that sort of goes to my concern round all of this, is that, because you're not taking in, and even if you were accepting this in the first year, that you have to take this and reduce pay bill very quickly, certainly the arguments for doing a more strategic or planned, or bringing workforce planning into it for the next, years 2, 3, 4, I think would that not be something that the FP would want?
It's an interesting debating point, but we are where we are, and we are going to have to reduce numbers quickly. The challenge for myself, other permanent secretaries, the senior civil service, is to lead and manage our way through this. And actually, the one thing that has perhaps surprised me is actually there's a lot of enthusiasm and energy around this, because aside from the voluntary exit scheme, the reduction from 12 departments down to 9 is something that's been really welcomed. I think it will lead to more streamlined government, and people see a real opportunity here to actually provide better services, better outcomes for citizens as a result of this. And, there is, and indeed we had a couple of working groups yesterday with a selection of senior civil servants, and Bridget was at one of these, and it was actually quite surprising, the enthusiasm across the piece for here's an opportunity to change, and to change for the better. So, glass is more than half full at the moment.
Well, I mean, certainly I take your point, Chair, around the changes in department. I do think it's the one thing that possibly looks as if it has been at least well thought out, what services and functions are going to each department, and what makes sense to have where. And I do think, credit's due on that. That looks as if it's been thought out. I'm just concerned that we're in such a haste to deliver the voluntary exit scheme, because we've put off public sector reform for so long now. We're ending up rushing into a system that is not as well managed or as well thought out as perhaps I would like to have seen it.
Look, it'll not be easy, but I'm reasonably confident that we'll get through this, and we'll have business continuity, and I'm still pretty confident we'll actually be doing a lot of things better. But you can call me back in a year, 18 months' time, and
well, if the Assembly's still here.
Phone him.
I'm still here.
So thanks, Chair.
Adrian?
Thanks. Just want to ask you, David, about staff morale through all this here. How are you going to maintain it at a level that's workable for the people who think, don't give a damn about this here now?
Yeah, it's going back to the point I was just making there, not just at senior management level, and I'll ask Bridget to comment on this as well, because Bridget's been working across the department at trying to find savings, etc. But I have been surprised in the department at the level of enthusiasm there has been for change, and people, people see what's going to happen over the next year as an opportunity to fix some things that we have needed to fix for a long time. The challenge now really is to give people an opportunity to do that. Yes, some people will be anxious. We're going to be asking some people to move to new jobs in locations that they maybe don't want to work to. But the reality is, above AA and AO, all grades in the civil service are mobile. And, throughout my career, I have been at times asked to do jobs that I thought, I don't really want to do that, but I've done it, and I've always got value out of it.
Paid off at the end of it.
It has actually paid off, yeah. And I think the experience you get from moving around frequently actually brings value to the job you're doing. So, I think I think certainly the spirit in the organisation is still strong, and I think we as managers and leaders need to capture that and get the best out of it. I don't know, do you want to?
No, I mean, I think, as David said, I've been going around the department, I've attended a lot of workshops looking for savings, and yeah, there is a lot of feeling of actually, you know, this is an opportunity, and some of the things maybe that, as David said, that we've maybe wanted to do for years, but there's a feeling that there's maybe a will to consider them more now. And so I think there are obviously people who are more reluctant to change than others, but there are others for whom change is a motivator in itself, and who are actually motivated to deliver change more so than to continue with the status quo. So,
Also, I get
Yeah.
on board. I just asked you about those people who are applying for it. Then, how can they be sure that what the scheme they're applying for will be the same as the scheme that the Health Service, the Education Board runs out? Is they're going to be the same schemes, or some?
There won't be the same schemes. Obviously, I can't remember. I think there are probably in excess of 50, 60 different employers across the wider public sector who will be looking to access the Transformation Fund. In the time available, you couldn't develop a single scheme for the whole of the public sector. You think people working in the health sector will be availing of schemes that have been agreed at national level. The civil service scheme was only recently reviewed a couple of years ago, and quite a lot of other public sector schemes, arm's length bodies, have schemes that are tied to the civil service scheme. But if you take, we've got NILGOS, we've got health schemes, we've got education schemes, we've got civil service schemes, it wouldn't be possible to develop a single scheme quickly. So there will be differences, but by and large the differences aren't huge, but there are just some differences.
Monetary value, the differences there as well, isn't it? Is that what the difference is?
Yes, some are slightly more generous than others, but you're not always comparing apples and oranges. You know, there will just be different features to each scheme.
Yeah, thanks.
David, there's an article in the Belfast Telegraph about freedom of information delays, and the department has been flagged up along with Cumbria Council, Nottingham City Council and Salford City Council as the only 4 cases where the authorities involved took considerably longer in the statutory time limit of 20 working days to respond. Is that something that should be considered in terms of targets for the next financial year, given?
Well, we're under ICO watch for, I think it's a period of 3 months, so certainly I think the intention would be to move out of ICO watch by the end of that period.
And what was the reasons for those delays?
Well, I don't really want to go into a sort of detailed explanation of why we are where we are, but I think it's safe to say that there's a commitment to getting us out of ICO watch.
Well, can we go into the detail? I mean, how many cases were you talking about, and what were the reasons for the delays? Because we've complained a number of times, even in terms of papers coming to the committee from the department, so if it's also spreading the FOA responses to the public, then it is of great concern.
Well, we'll be working with the Information Commissioner. I think the particular problem has involved a number of cases which are quite old. You know, those will be the focus of our work with the Information Commissioner over the next couple of months.
How old are we talking?
We're talking a few years.
So is that requests that have been submitted and they haven't been responded to in years, or?
Yeah, it's a number of cases that are outstanding.
Okay. Okay, members, any other questions? Happy enough. Okay, David, Bridget, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, members, moving on to the review of the operation of the Barnett formula. There's a bio note on Professor Burrell at page 25 of your packs, terms of reference page 26. and the preparation sheet at pages 4 and 5. There's also a briefing paper provided by the Professor at pages 6 to 10 of your tabled packs. Good morning, Professor.
Morning.
Very welcome. Professor, do you want to give us some opening comments
Yes.
as evidence, and then we'll go to
Yes.
questions?
For about how long? For about
How long do you want?
not too long.
So that's okay.
There were 7 points, which just do it fairly briefly. Not more than 10 minutes or something.
Okay.
I apologise first for sort of croaking at you. I've got one of these colds the last few days. So, yeah, I thought I'd focus on Barnett Formula and relationship with Northern Ireland, largely to keep the Northern Ireland issues, because I think maybe you've had quite a lot of evidence about Scotland and Wales and so on. So I'd 7 issues really about Barnett and Northern Ireland. I'll go through them fairly briefly, and you probably may not want to pick up on all of them, but then come back to a few of them. The Barnett Formula, of course, I do meet people who think it was named after the Vice-Chancellor of Ulster University, but it's not of course. The first issue, the view of the Treasury, which I think is quite important, that the Treasury has been very attached to the Barnett Formula and still is, and it was very noticeable when David Cameron appeared immediately after the Scottish referendum to make his vow. He did put in it that they did not see the Barnett Formula changing, and there has been this very strong Treasury commitment that it's robust, it works well. They haven't seen convincing reasons for changing it, and I just listed some of those reasons. That it's simple to apply. One civil servant can do it each year. It removes the need for direct negotiations. It's a robust mechanism, room for alteration in it. It affects each of the devolved administrations roughly equally. There hasn't been a lot of conflict, or at least maybe until fairly recently, about it. It makes the allocations fairly predictable, that each of the devolved administrations knows what's coming. And as I say, only recently has there really been any serious issues about whether it should be changed or difficulties with it. The second issue is funding outside Barnett. You may already have covered that. There's really 2 main things outside Barnett, but they are quite important for Northern Ireland to some extent. That sometimes the Northern Ireland system has been called Barnett Plus rather than just Barnett, and they are the role of annually managed expenditure. That only about 50% of Northern Ireland expenditure comes from Barnett, something like 40% from annually managed expenditure. And of course, the big item of that, very topical at the moment, is social security expenditure or welfare expenditure, which is annually managed and is therefore outside the Barnett calculation. And then secondly is the Barnett bypass, as it's called, where in fact other items of funding bypass Barnett. They're not part of the calculation. such as special allocations. Mentioned special allocation of the cost of devolved to policing when that happened, the reinvestment and reform initiative, maybe some of the more current funding items. And that's one of the reasons why maybe the convergence argument about devolution has not really happened. I know it's usually put down to population factors, but that could be another factor. Now, thirdly, of course, is the alternative, and this, of course, is what people tend to talk about whenever there's any current discussion about Barnet. If you go to any conference or academic conference about Barnet, this is actually what it's about nowadays, about how you'd replace it with a needs assessment. And that is not immediately a simple thing to do. Now, it tends to attract quite a lot of support. I mentioned there that the House of Lords inquiry, they had supported. Politicians tend to support it a lot. The media support it a lot. There's a lot of support. It seems to have an appeal. But when you drill down into it, it does become much more difficult and difficult to do and difficult in terms of producing a need for negotiation and dispute and so on. And if you are moving to needs, there's 3 points just about that. One is, originally Barnet was thought to encompass needs. That's why it was set up. It was set up originally to say, if we look roughly at populations, we will meet needs. So roughly, it was the intention was for it to be a formula that roughly met need, and it was sort of equitable throughout the UK. Now things moved away a bit from that, but to actually replace it with a needs assessment system, you probably have to do it in either one of two ways, either through a broad brush approach. You take 4 or 5 indicators like population, number of elderly people, number of children, number of people in low income, broad brush approach, or else you have to produce maybe dozens of formula or principles, and then that's where it becomes very difficult, because that immediately would lead to conflict and disputes. The one I think that's sometimes brought up in Wales is, say, about making calculations for the Welsh language. It's one that is counted as a need and so on. And who does this then? Who has the final say? And of course there are ideas about giving that to an independent body, but that wouldn't really make it much more simpler, and might even lead just then to passing it on to more senior politicians and so on, or Treasury officials to resolve. Northern Ireland actually originally, a long time ago, had a sort of independent body to adjudicate. Before the Barnet formula, it had a body called the Joint Exchequer Board, which had sort of equivalent of Department of Finance person, equivalent of a Treasury person, and an independent chair who actually resolved disputes before Barnet about Northern Ireland allocations. And something like that has been suggested again. You can also note that the JMC, the Joint Ministerial Committee that now operates, it occasionally does resolve financial disputes, as about the Olympic Games monies. So that's where you go with a needs assessment. And of course, the background to that is that at present the Barnet formula is more benevolent to Scotland, gives them more than they need. Wales gives them less than they need, probably. Northern Ireland's maybe roughly about right, or that seems to be a sort of academic view on it. Point 4, Treasury Statement of Funding Policy. This again is the kind of guidelines. It's not statutory, but they are the guidelines really to the working of the Barnet formula. The framework of public expenditure control, and it does show, of course, that that the Treasury is very much in control. There has been quite a lot of speculation that with the changes in devolved powers in Scotland and Wales that are coming or likely to come, this would have to be radically changed. You could not have the Treasury in laying down all the rules and interpreting the rules, but that's not necessarily the case. I mean, when you look at devolution, macroeconomic policy, fiscal policy is not devolved. It is a responsibility of the UK government, and probably in Northern Ireland, people are maybe more aware of that than in Scotland and Wales, because I do find people in Scotland, they tend to assume that devolution there, or with the Smith recommendations, the Smith Commission recommendations, it'll have more powers than Northern Ireland, but that's not really the case. I mean, even with the Smith Commission recommendations, the system in Northern Ireland has more devolved powers than Scotland. So, in a sense, we're a bit more aware about the nature of non-devolved powers. So that position is likely to continue, the Treasury in control with the Barnett formula. It is open to interpretation, and of course, again, there's one topical part of it, and that is what it has to say about social security, because the statement of funding says that specifically if, for example, the Northern Ireland Executive changed social security policy to differ from the rest of the UK ministers will need to take a view on whether and how to adjust this funding. Now, the issue that has come to some people's attention is the wording this funding, because that would seem to imply that the UK government could remove the money they give for social security, but it doesn't necessarily imply that they should alter the whole block grant, or you can interpret it like that, which just indicates that the statement of funding policy for the devolved administrations, which is, of course, covers Barnett plus the other funding, both DEL and AME funding, is quite important, but it can be open to interpretation, and then who resolves the matter. If there's a dispute, do you then go to a joint exchequer board type body, or the JMC? Fifthly, I'll just do fifthly and sixthly and seventh very briefly, just to a few more minutes. Fifthly is something that I thought did fit in. It tends to be mentioned in the context of Barnett, that subventions to Northern Ireland, the total subventions, and of course it's accepted that Northern Ireland is highly dependent on support through Barnett and other funding. There's an argument often made that it should become less dependent. But if you look at the actual stats, sorry, the time I had, I couldn't find more up to date, but these are fairly up to date because they're from the Silk Commission, which was not so long since Silk was published in Wales, and they gave regional expenditure to the 12 regions of the UK. You see that in gross terms, of course, Northern Ireland is the lowest, as you might expect. The fiscal balance, however, is interesting. That's the difference between what income is raised in the country and the actual expenditure, because only one region of the UK, London, is in a surplus. So all the other 11 are dependent. Sometimes the southeast of England also moves into a surplus. It's the only other one. Sometimes it does. And this year it happened to be down -1, but sometimes it's a plus. And of course, in terms of the actual balance itself, Northern Ireland's in the middle. The balance is not as great as, say, the northeast or northwest of England. Now, if you work it out per capita, of course, the Northern Ireland position is worse, but it's just interesting that when you look in details at the figures, all countries have regions that are dependent on the centre. The sixth one, which I wanted to say something about before briefly finishing on, just noting the seventh, Barnett consequentials. Now, the reason I mention this is that it does appear to be, whenever I tried to look at it, which is a few years ago, I haven't really been working on this recently, it was quite difficult to find the data or the figures on Barnett consequentials. And I therefore thought it useful to quote from the work of David Heald, who did try to investigate this. I don't know if he's giving evidence at all, but David Heald from Aberdeen University is probably the top academic on Barnett formula. And he has done some work relating to Northern Ireland. And the Barnett consequential is really the extra money that comes through Barnett during the financial year. It's the extra items of expenditure that the UK government launches, big items of expenditure. And therefore, if the calculation is that this expenditure is England-only expenditure, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales get a cut, as it were. They get a cut through Barnett. This is normally fairly straightforward. There was a row that you may be familiar with about the Olympic Games spending. But what tends to happen is that a lot of the information is not readily open to the public gaze about the Barnett consequentials. Now, David Heald did produce figures for Northern Ireland. These are Northern Ireland figures that form formula consequences to Northern Ireland from the UK departments. Now, it's a bit out of date, but I imagine the balance is still somewhat similar. And what's worth noting that it does tend to be dominated by health and children, schools and children and health. They make up most of the Barnett consequentials because that's where extra money in Britain is being put at present. That's what they're protecting, health, social care to some extent, and education. So all those consequentials are flowing in. Relatively little consequentials for some other items, and you see zeros there and so on coming to Northern Ireland. Now, the other question then is what happens to that money, because the discretion to spend Barnett consequentials purely rests with the devolved administration. They don't have to spend the money on health and so on. But there is a question that if overall policies are the same, say, like transforming care, if the policies are the same, if health is in trouble throughout the UK, is there a view that, if the consequentials come, they should go to health? That's really the controversial issue. So if 60% of the consequentials are coming into Northern Ireland because of health expenditure in Britain, does it matter where they go? Barnett is saying maybe they should, well, you can interpret it. Is Barnett saying, all things considered, you should maybe spend this on health? So that's a controversy, as opposed to, say, roads or something. So that's the... I think actually David Heald, he couldn't actually find that out in relation to those figures, where the money actually... I mean, it maybe just disappeared into the pot. So that was the sixth point. And finally, I won't really go through this one because it's about increased fiscal devolution. Everyone's aware of what's kind of happening, corporation tax and other duties, and I think you've probably got evidence explaining what's going to happen in Scotland and Wales, the idea of devolving part of income tax, with the important sort of caveat that if Scotland, will apply first of all to Scotland, if Scotland changes it, the change has to be the same for each band. So at present it's 10, 40, 10, 30, 40, they can't make it 10, 30, 50, they're not. I think Holtum was keen that Wales should be able to do that, but the UK government and Treasury aren't keen. And probably it's fair to say, finally, there's no strong support really for partial devolution of income tax to Northern Ireland. It's not really discussed very much. Of course, it's an initiative by this committee that it probably will be discussed now, or at least brought to people's attention. But obviously, the power to, as you say, raise income tax is not one that might appeal to a great many people. So I won't say any more about that one. Sorry for croaking a bit.
Thanks, Professor. Just on that final point, actually, I was just thinking when Alan Trench made a presentation, not only to committee, but a number of presentations he's done in the Assembly in the past couple of years, he has always said that the Assembly here should be going for income tax and not corporation tax. So do you have a view in terms of income tax whether it would be more beneficial for income tax as opposed to corporation tax come to the Assembly?
Well, I mean, the income tax one, I think corporation tax is a set of specific arguments. I mean, the main argument for having it in Scotland and Wales is to improve electoral accountability. It's so that the people in Scotland will know that there's a financial cost, and therefore at elections they can decide to vote for maybe lower taxes, but that might mean poorer services, or they can vote for a bit higher taxes and they're happy with that because it might mean better health services. So it's a mechanism, at least in part, or they're starting with it in Scotland and Wales, to as it were, improve, increase, bring in fiscal accountability through the electoral system. Now, I can't really see that working terribly well in Northern Ireland. It's not likely to be a huge issue at elections and so on. And the actual, I mean, I can't see Northern Ireland really having much room for wanting increases in tax. I mean, I'm not sure benefit greatly from increases in tax. The Barnett formula does give quite a bit of kind of wriggle room for doing things. It's not a kind of lock, like Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland present, they're able to have free prescriptions and so on. They can manoeuvre it from that. They can spend less money on roads. I think that's what actually happened in Scotland a bit. That they have spent money on social care, free prescriptions, free car parking at hospitals, and so on. So they've had to cut some things. And one of them has been on roads, actually, is where they've made some hefty cuts, especially SNP. So I mean, if you have 10% deducted and you try and fill that in with income tax, you're still getting Barnett. But I'm not quite sure that there's a tremendous advantage to Northern Ireland in being able to move around the income tax. I mean, it's no great appeal. I mean, the situation at present, you could say, well, the solution is we'll put up income tax by 1% if we're allowed to. So that might be one solution. But I imagine that wouldn't immediately produce a kind of political consensus.
Adrian?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Professor, for your presentation so far. Further to your point about funding outside Barnett, it has been a factor to explaining why there's not been a significant movement to convergence. To what extent has this been a factor to date, and how likely is it to be in the future?
Yeah, well, convergence is a difficult one. If you want to put professors on the spot, you could ask them why there's not been convergence, and it's usually explained in terms of population. That the changes in population have had I think David Hill called it a powerful factor in damping convergence. But the reason I'm saying there it is slightly different, as you're noting. It's really that when you look at the convergence argument, that the expenditure per head basically should converge. You're really maybe measuring therefore two slightly different things. You're measuring the input, which, say, comes from Barnet plus... no, you're measuring the input, which is Barnet, the input's Barnet, that should lead to convergence. But the output you're measuring is Barnet plus. So there's actually all these extra bits of money and payments which just block convergence. And I think that is a factor. But you will find a lot of discussion on convergence ends up saying it's all very puzzling. So
Exactly.
And of course, the other thing was the original population basis. That's why it was skewed. See, when the Barnet formula was started, I think, I'm not sure if he ever admitted to this, but roughly picked the figures out of the top of his head of 10, 5 and 85. That was Scotland, Wales and England. Northern Ireland, in 1978, Northern Ireland wasn't in it, the original formula. So it was 10, 5 and 58. I'm not sure that even reflected the population terribly accurately at the time. Scotland was 10, Wales was 5, England was 85. And that actually was more generous to Scotland. That was the original basis, because Scotland wasn't 10% of the population. And that had started then. When, by the time it came to Northern Ireland, it was the accurate figure, which was 2.7 or 2.8 or something.
How were we funded, just for my interest? How were we funded before that?
Well, it was done by negotiation and a series of agreements. It was done originally... sorry, I'll just take 2 minutes now. I know this because of my age, actually, that I was that I used to know it. Whenever Northern Ireland was set up, income tax, all the taxes were collected by the British government at the time, and they deducted certain amounts, which was like the imperial contribution, they called it at the time, which is the cost of foreign affairs and defence and so on. And they gave the rest of the money back to Northern Ireland and said that will be enough. That will pay for all your services. So the initial debate was just about the imperial contribution. And eventually, of course, the money wasn't enough by the time we reached the 1930s. And they said, well, OK, we'll scrap the imperial contribution. But it went on, and there were difficulties, but specific difficulties. So you started with a series of mainly social security agreement. That was, 1930s, a high unemployment. Northern Ireland couldn't meet the unemployment benefit needs. So they made a series of agreements, social security, national insurance parity agreements, leading, I think, which is where it stopped, in 1938, the Simon Agreement, he was the Chancellor at the time, whereby they would work this out overall and agree it each year with the Treasury, and they set up this joint exchequer board that would work out how much Northern Ireland should get from the Treasury. That is, it should get its income tax back that was raised in Northern Ireland, plus subvention, basically. And originally the subvention was not great. I mean, it's only the last 20 years or so that it's really the fiscal deficit has moved ahead. And the original idea in the 1920s was that it would work the other way around, that the British government would make money out of Northern Ireland, not that it would have to support it at all. It was meant to be the other way around. And some of the agreements are like that. Whichever fund, like redundancy payments, whichever fund was a deficit, the other, well, the Northern Ireland government, the British government would come to each other's rescue. On that basis.
We'll move back to the topic that we already talked about. Let's take into account the caveats and the considerations which you highlighted in section 3 of your paper. What would you see the likely outcome for Northern Ireland from moving to the needs-based system?
Well, as I said, looking at it, generally you would think Northern Ireland would benefit because needs are high in terms of low income and high sort of long-term unemployment and sort of child poverty figures and costs, and so if you went through a range of socio-economic indicators, the needs in Northern Ireland would be quite high, and therefore it might benefit. But there probably are other considerations if you start to look at detailed items. As I said, there's two ways of doing a very broad brush stroke approach, which is neat like that. Therefore, that is fairly simple. It's split like population plus some socio-economic indicators. And that broad brush approach, Northern Ireland would do reasonably well. Whether it be much better, is not too sure. But if you're going through a lot of detailed comparisons, and Scotland and Wales might insist on that, or the UK government might insist on that, you start asking Northern Ireland to justify all sorts of things, like the one that's mentioned in the recent agreement about the cost of managing a divided society. They might ask about water charges, is there to turn that into a need, and therefore Northern Ireland doesn't do so well. Housing, you see, Northern Ireland, those other figures, they get very little in housing consequentials, because practically all housing expenditure in Northern Ireland is seen as unnecessary in Britain, because in Britain they've got rid of all the social housing, so they don't. It's not a cost in public expenditure. So it's so if you take a very detailed approach to need, Northern Ireland might actually do worse. If it's a broad brush approach, just looking at population and socio-economic indicators, probably Northern Ireland would do a bit better, but it's maybe not going to make a huge difference.
If we move to that there, it sort of ends up back to the 1930s again, back in the same situation, housing and benefiting.
Well, the housing one arises because of what's called stock transfer in Britain, that most of the social housing or local authority housing has all been transferred to housing associations, so it's no longer public funded directly out of public funds. But Northern Ireland, it just at the moment, I mean, it's trying to, as you know, it's trying to do that actually at the moment. So in the future that may happen anyway. But if it doesn't, it just means Northern Ireland has this extra housing pressures that it has to meet out of its block grant.
Okay, Leslie.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Professor. I found your paper very interesting, I must say. Particularly there where you talk about convergence when we're actually diverging. It seems to be getting worse. But my question to you relates to the implications of devolving fiscal power. In your paper, you make the point that the formula really means revenue raising powers given to devolved administrations, who in turn then simply really control the expenditure. What do you see as the impact of devolving further fiscal powers to Northern Ireland, indeed the regions?
Well, I take the last one first. The discussion has got a bit more complex in Britain because of this regional dimension that's being introduced, which follows the Scottish referendum, of course. In that Barnett has worked fairly successfully because it's Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland only. It's almost nothing to do with England, in a sense. The formula, but now that we've got some discussion about fiscal devolution in Scotland and Wales raising some of their income tax and ever having control of it, there's been some demand in the English regions for that, and there isn't really any demand for devolution because the disaster in the northeast of England, where everyone voted against having a northeastern devolved government. But the idea is to somehow import it into local government. That's where it does get complex, that you would have groupings of local authorities, a bit like the London model, Boris Johnson model, that they could actually qualify, as it were, for a Barnett-type allocation. And it is very complex because you're then interchanging the whole basis of local government expenditure. The regional thing makes it quite difficult. But Scotland, of course, it sees fiscal devolution as just a start. It would go on and on. It was 3% tartan tax they never used. 10% now in the Scotland bill. Following Smith Commission, they may try and push that up, but they would want to go until Scotland had total control over all its income tax. Now, it is a bit disputed, but the argument in Scotland is that Scotland contributes more in income tax than they get back, and if you add to that oil revenues, then Scotland is flying, as it were. It could be independent. So the income tax basis in Scotland makes it possible that Scotland would have a lot to gain from more and more control over its income tax and scrapping Barnett, as it were. Now, that's not the case in Wales and Northern Ireland. Their tax bases would be very low because they're poorer areas, they're not heavily industrialised, they don't have a big export market and so on. The quite large numbers of children and old people, the increasing population. Scotland, strangely, has a declining population. And therefore, there isn't a tax basis. So giving Northern Ireland 100% income tax raising powers probably wouldn't make much difference to what income they would have. Scotland, it would. Northern Ireland, to a slightly lesser extent, Wales, it's argued, hasn't got a lot to benefit from. So
What about sales taxes, Professor? Has that been considered?
Sales tax is usually considered about local government because it's local sales tax. You might. The only place I ever come across it is the States. The States is sales tax.
Yeah. I think it's a county system in the States.
Yeah. It's usually associated with local government. So the only place I've ever come across it discussed is some of the papers about reforming the rates or council tax. I mean, it was looked at in Scotland because a few years, I think they're about to start another look at the council tax in Scotland, but they had one a few years ago, and they did look at sales tax, but they thought it was too complicated, too costly to administer, and probably wouldn't make a great deal of difference, and might benefit wealthy areas or the areas with more shopping than other local authorities. So they said no to the sales tax. And I think the VAT, which is sort of a bit linked to sales tax, as far as I understand it, the EU doesn't allow regions to have different rates of VAT. So that tends not to be discussed very much. You get it between North and South in Ireland, of course, but that's because of the separate sovereign jurisdiction. So I think the VAT one is not regarded as much of a runner.
Last tricky one. What happens if we come out of Europe then?
Well, the direct question, the one where you can be a bit clear about is that, well, there's two things. Northern Ireland, I suppose the one thing it would lose out on was the special European funding, because that obviously would just disappear. And of course, EU peace funding, as it's called, forget its full name, but EU peace funding has brought in a considerable amount of money, so in a sense it lose that. The rest of Northern Ireland's EU income largely comes through the UK government and Treasury, and therefore it would be a matter of seeing what immediately replaced that, if there's European special funding, Interreg and so on. Does that all just go, or are there some special, say, UK systems to replace it? And then there's a whole wider issue of how it affects the economy. Is there any benefit from the contributions that the UK makes? They're putting in more than they're getting out, and and people argue about that. I mean, it's quite a while ago now, but certainly 10 years ago or so, there were some figures showing that, a bit surprisingly, Northern Ireland got less out of it than they put in. How do you work out what Northern Ireland put in? Well, it was a mathematical calculation. They just calculated that, 2.8% of what the UK Treasury was passing over, that must have come from Northern Ireland, as it were. But they weren't getting 2.8% back and so on.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Leslie. Professor, Section 5 of your paper contains a number of figures in terms of expenditure and fiscal balance. How have those been calculated, and is there different methodologies, like say between here, Scotland, and some of the other areas of England and Wales, or is there a consistency?
I imagine they're fairly consistent. I mean, this came from the Silk Commission, but they would have been using Treasury figures at the time. So within those particular figures, I think would have been fairly accurate and comparable. Now, people may have done it since differently. I think Oxford Economics did produce some figures on it, but I just couldn't find them. Maybe more recently, but it's just done on a figure for total public expenditure. I imagine it would be calculated similarly for each region, and then they've probably got there probably are Treasury figures, I imagine, on what the income was, and they've just made a calculation of the balance. I think it's fairly accurate, the thing about Greater London or the South East, because that is sort of well known that those are the only two that ever show a surplus, and I think it's quite well known that the north of England is also, of course, more dependent. That's why, I mean, the other question was asked that Scotland might do quite well out of having independent sources of income and its strong tax revenue, its big financial services industry in Edinburgh and so on. And it is thought that it would do much better than most of England, of England, if you had regionalised income tax revenue powers. The tax base in Scotland stronger, certainly, than the north of England.
And a number of commentators have raised concerns about the lack of transparent public finance data, or independent public finance data. I mean, the data we largely rely on is Treasury data. So how could that be addressed in the future to provide assurance, if the Assembly or some of the other institutions decide to devolve further fiscal powers? How do you ensure that those processes are fair?
I mean, the Treasury figures, Treasury figures. There are other sources in England that are quite more independent. The Office of Budget Responsibility was set up as an independent body. To sometimes criticise the current Conservative government positions on the economy and so on. The Office of National Statistics in Britain has a guaranteed degree of independence, I think more so than the Statistical Research Unit in Northern Ireland, which hasn't got the same degree of independence. I know that it's just because I know the background from talking to him, so this is kind of second hand, but David Field in his paper, which he published on the consequentials in Northern Ireland, he did have to go through freedom of information requests to get the data. It's not normally published by DFP on the details of the Barnett consequentials or source, which is the one that's published here. And I think he was just told that the figures for what happened to each of the Barnett consequentials weren't available, presumably because they went into the pot. Just that the DFP actually couldn't trace exactly where the consequential amount went to. So that on table 6, if there was 29 million as a Barnett consequential for transport. When it came into DFP here, they couldn't actually account for where the 29 million then passed on to. That wasn't in their bookkeeping. That's what he said at the time. That was 2010, I think. So it may have changed, but I mean, it would be, I suppose, worth knowing if it's possible to do that, or if.
Okay, Michaela.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Professor Burrell, for your very informative presentation. Just in Section 6 on the Barnett consequentials, you note that there is uncertainty over the DFP allocation of the Barnett consequentials to executive departments here. Not wanting you to repeat yourself, but what modifications would be required to clarify this process?
Well, I suppose what I've just been saying, what we're looking for is kind of almost a table. I mean, because of being involved in writing and research and so on, you tend to look for it presented in a fairly straightforward or tabular way. Now, what the department or the minister or politicians might take the view is that they need some discretion over what happens to it. They might require some discretion, and they prefer to, have the discretion to make general statements about it. I mean, they may be quite happy. I think that there was a recent example of it, because this comes all sorts of different ways. You see, some of it's probably unknown. I mean, if culture and sport get 3 million, nobody may know about it, kind of thing. But if it's quite a large amount, there would be it would be in the public arena. I think recently the latest increase in health expenditure in England was publicised. I even forget the reason why they said they were doing it in England, but that did bring in. I think the Minister for Health here did make a statement that this meant that so many million were being passed here as a consequential. Give an actual figure. I'm not sure if it may even have added something about what it was going to be spent on. I can't know. So it's not, as it were, a totally secretive thing, but it just helps in your overall calculations of, say, each year in the financial accounts. You could trace what happened to the Barnett consequentials.
Chair, if you just allow me one more. Do you have any thoughts, Professor, on how we address the limitations in our current finance system in relation to the Westminster reductions here? Would you have any recommendations how we could enhance the budget?
Well, there's a lot of suggestions in the media and commentators and so on, and it can be quite difficult. It's easy to pluck things out of the air, but without considering all the implications of them. I mean, you have things like, how can we, given that the reductions in Barnett and funding and reductions by the UK Treasury and so on. Obviously, the approach is to go and try and renegotiate things, and that, of course, is I mean, if we go back to the start of this, I mean, the current negotiations, they're not technically about Barnett because they're about the social security. In a sense, Barnett formula was meant to avoid that kind of situation. It was meant to avoid having to go into negotiations every year or something to try to get more funding and so on. You can anything that's suggested you have to consider in detail. I mean, free prescriptions is quite a good one because, in fact, cancelling free prescriptions may actually not save any money in the long run, the way the system operates. So you can get, these sort of unintended consequences. But I think, either you opt for the very radical thing. I suppose corporation tax just about makes a radical thing, or devolving income tax where you think it's going to make a difference, or borrowing more money. So the devolved administrations, although they have borrowing powers compared to a sovereign government, they have very limited borrowing powers. I mean, it's an odd situation in Ireland, really, that Northern Ireland government has very tiny borrowing powers. The government in Dublin has huge borrowing powers. Always maybe use them wisely, but they do have huge borrowing powers. Northern Ireland's very limited, so there's the borrowing, and then you can just focus on trying to improve difficult areas. I mean, that's what happened a bit in Scotland and Wales. I mean, Scottish and Welsh governments, because they're kind of left of centre government, so they've been very much focused on using their devolved powers to deflect some of the effects of austerity measures, and they can do that through their big local government system and so on. And they would have looked at areas about youth unemployment and so on in that sense. So apart from the UK government setting, there's a range of measures, but there's not really one thing as such.
A plethora of them.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thanks.
Okay, John.
Thanks, Chair. There's round, and apologies, Professor, that I'm about to speak to a school group, but around the points about the neutral regulator, and you talked about the Treasury statement of funding policy and how difficult that can be to challenge. You'd also brought us back round, I think it was the Joint Exchequer Board. You talked about. That's probably a name of something that most of us hadn't heard of, or going back quite a while now. But it was round that idea or the case for an independent arbitrator, regulator, or do you think there is a case for it or not? I mean, some of the evidence we've had was that there should be something, whether it was like the Office of Budget Responsibility or someone that would make the...
Yeah, well, it's come up as an issue, I think, because the smooth working of Barnett, particularly before devolution to Scotland and Wales, has of course been disrupted now as devolution's become embedded, and there's problems have arisen, say Scotland, Wales, as well as Northern Ireland. With the Barnett, it's not as smooth and robust maybe as they thought, and given the political complexities of government and so on, and therefore you've had some you've had some disputes, whether they're major disputes yet, but you've had some disputes, and there's been not a great way of settling of these. I mean, you can say, as Kent has been saying, the existing system, it does more or less give final power and control to the Treasury, or the Treasury and the Secretary of State. When it's come up in some financial issues in Scotland, the Scottish Secretaries of State have been quite helpful, as far as we can see, the Scottish Finance Minister and so on in resolving issues. The Welsh Secretary of State, not the current one, but the previous one, was very unhelpful, probably why it was moved eventually, but got into quite a few disputes with the Welsh administration, because he kept insisting he would decide and they didn't really matter. Northern Ireland, I better not say anything about the current Secretary of State, probably begin with fairly non-interventionist. Means had to intervene more, of course, but more lately. But then you move to the argument and say, well, this isn't fair or right, or it's not treating the devolved administrations equitably or with respect, or whatever. So you're then looking at some intergovernmental mechanism, as you're saying. Now, there already is one, of course, which is the Joint Ministerial Committee, which meets 3 or 4 times a year between the 4 administrations. There is also, I think it's once or twice a year, the 4 finance ministers meet. They have a quadrilateral, as it's called, quadrilateral finance ministers, where they could iron out a dispute or problem. And if it's a difficult one, then I think at the moment the only place would be the JMC, and they did resolve the Olympics consequentials row. It did go to the JMC, but the JMC is not really organised to do that. I mean, it can't have a dispute resolution role. So you're then asking, should there be a special mechanism, and who would be on it, and who would do it, and is it totally independent, or is it representatives from the 4 governments or whoever's in dispute, or is it representatives plus an independent chair, which is a bit like the joint executive thing, or is it a totally independent panel? Now, once you have a totally independent panel, particularly about key elements of public finance, you're into issues about accountability and democratic control and so on. So I don't think that would be too popular in the UK. If they did set up such a body, you know, it might be given an advisory function to make a recommendation to the Treasury, which is just you know, adding another decision-making line or hurdle. I can't. I'm trying to think, because it's a long time since I've looked at. But I imagine federal systems, they may have some mechanism like that. I'm not quite sure. You know, the 3 big federal systems are the States, Canada, and Australia, and I don't quite know if they get into that. But you see, the UK government could argue, well, this isn't federalism. This is devolution. The devolved administrations are subordinate.
Times, of course, in places like the US, you cannot have, they would refer maybe states, between the powers of the states and rights of the states and the federal government. They maybe ended up at the US Supreme Court.
Oh, yes, you can have
to resolve that. Is that something that we could end up having it referred to the UK?
If it's a legal issue, it could, yes, if there's a legal point. Because everything connected with the Northern Ireland Act or the Wales and Scotland Act are subject to judicial reviews. Just pick a legal case.
And then would some type of body not be more desirable?
Oh yes, that would be, yes.
Ending up letting...
Yes, but whether it could actually have decision-making powers is what I doubt. It could be advisory, and the devolution... Because it's devolution, you always have in the background that, you know, the UK government is in a more powerful position. The House of Commons, the Parliament, is the sovereign authority. You know, it has. You know, House of Commons can act over, as you know, over the heads of Northern Ireland Assembly, Wales, Scotland at any time. You know, it can pass.
I'd have to do that sooner.
It can pass any law that it wishes. It will be binding on Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. So I'm not sure whether Treasury ministers and officials would actually, you know, with the ease say, well, we'll set up this body and fly in somebody from Canada or somewhere who'll tell us how much money we're going to allocate to Scotland. I don't think they would find that terribly acceptable. You know, I think the Treasury view would always be to look for a statement of policy and guidance. So that the solution might be to beef up the Treasury statement of funding the devolved administrations. That's the guidance, and so if it's not working, then they might need to revisit those rules and so on.
We could just bring you back to some of your opening comment was around the needs-based assessment. You seem to find that even both of the House of Lords looked at this, that is it more, and then probably a theme maybe from a lot of the evidence we've got, that to go to replace Barnett just almost poses more questions and problems than it's perhaps worth, and not that in the Northern Ireland Assembly I think we're likely to advocate replacing it, given we do relatively well out of it. Some comments around that, and also you talked about Barnett consequentials, things like, and because we've, 60% of our spending or whatever is health and education, when those are protected by the national government, we have done relatively well, and hence we haven't maybe had as much of the pain of austerity as we might otherwise have had. And things like, even when the national government decides to do free school meals in England, we get something in the region of £20 million, which we didn't adopt in the state. I think it maybe just went into the pot. But it's round that idea that we've been largely protected because of decisions made by UK government.
See, I think the bodies that have looked at it, like the House of Lords and a lot of other studies and so on, they tend to focus a lot on Wales. It's a lot of Welsh influence. Wales, they seem to be able to produce an analysis that shows Wales hasn't done so well out of Barnett in terms of meeting their needs, that their needs haven't been...
Because they've reached the convergence level.
Yeah, and there are special problems in Wales because a lot of things are so integrated with England that it's difficult to separate out as well. And like law and justice and police, justice is still not devolved to Wales and so on. But Wales certainly, and investigations in Wales have tended always to argue that Barnett doesn't actually meet identifiable needs in Wales. So that tends, I think, to push the argument into saying we must look at some alternative. And I think it's not helped by the fact, I think, that Joel Barnett himself thought it should be replaced by a needs assessment. Joel Barnett, who invented it some years ago, he said that. But sorry, you were asking.
Well, I was just going to make the point as well, Neil. Just when I was having to go out, you were starting to talk about, say, the issue around tax varying powers. Do you think if we go down, you have had different commissions look at this for Scotland, Wales, you've had, there's sort of ongoing debate, I suppose, here, though I don't feel that we're far down the road. Do you think if you do go down the road of tax varying powers, whatever those might happen to be, more than maybe just corporation tax or a level of income tax, does that drive your devolved administrations to be more policy driven or more responsible about what they're spending because they're raising some of that money directly from people that suffer the consequence?
That's very much where this debate started in Scotland and Wales. It would make the government more responsible and accountable to the electorate because they had all these responsibilities for spending the money, but they didn't have any responsibilities for raising the money, or very little of it, mainly local council tax and rates. That was the original argument. And if you do devolve some of the minor taxes, it doesn't bring in huge amounts of money, but it probably does mean that people broadly link that to what the Assembly or Executive or ministers are doing, so it might generate more of a debate and discussion about whether that's a proper use of money. I mean, the air passenger thing's a bit like that, and it's usually now the same 3 or 4 minor taxes that are discussed, but some of the other possibilities aren't. So I didn't mention this, but aren't discussed much, because if you go back to the old Stormont system, some other taxes were devolved, like motor vehicle tax and road tax and so on, and therefore you might say that was localised, so there was a discussion about whether you should raise the rates and so on and improve the roads. So certainly all those other items of taxation, there might be arguments for making it more locally accountable. There might, in the long run, improve aspects of government, I suppose.
Thank you.
Peter?
Thank you, Professor, for very extensive considerations. I just want to maybe touch on two issues very briefly, and to some extent you've gone into this to some degree already on that, but I suppose just first of all, in terms of the wider context of changing the Barnett formula of wider UK considerations, and obviously particularly arising out of the Scottish situation, there's been the start of a debate around the English votes for English legislation, the potential devolution down to regions and that type of thing. I suppose we'll just wrap up the two questions in one. I mean, first of all, what impact do you see that debate having on the wider future of the Barnett formula? And I suppose, secondly, you know, I suppose you've caveated various things in terms of the way forward, but in terms of way forward of what you see as suiting Northern Ireland or likely to be achieved by Northern Ireland, what would be your recommendation, if you like, for the what direction of travel we should be going in?
Yeah, well, it'll be possible to see how the 10% reduction in Scotland works. I mean, it's meant to start this year because it was already passed in 2012 legislation, so it's not part of the Smith Commission outcome. So it would be worth monitoring how that does work in Scotland and how they use it. I mean, it could be a total damn squib, and it's like the 3% tartan tax. They don't use it at all, and then there's a lot of discussion about nothing, and that may be followed by Wales. So there's a little bit of uncertainty about how it works, and then you can check that for Northern Ireland. The position in England is, there's a general issue, as you say, about English votes and so on, and a general perception that England is subsidising Scotland, as it were, wider perception. And of course that will be increased now with the election of the position of the SNP and Labour Party and so on. So it's a kind of general, you know, the Scots are doing well out of us kind of thing. And that is seen through the Barnett formula, and it's seen through the per capita expenditure, which is still higher in Scotland. The Scots reply, well, we're not actually getting back through the formula the total income tax is raised in Scotland, and we're not getting our full whack out of oil revenues. So there's that kind of Scottish dimension too. You've a bit of a conflict, and I think, as you're kind of indicating, rather than dampen down the conflict, make it worse, actually, because of between, as it were, Scotland and England over who's financing who and so on. In terms of what Northern Ireland could ask for, they certainly could start. I mean, in a sense, it's maybe this committee starting it, but there hasn't always been a debate about the 10% income tax or changing that, and it's been dominated really by corporation tax in the last two or 3 years, which is a kind of specific item, and I think that's probably the best thing to do is to monitor the Scottish and Welsh systems and see what happens if it might be of any benefit. If Barnett is scrapped, of course, then Northern Ireland would have to move quickly to produce alternative mechanisms. And in the meantime, it could look again at the devolution of some of the other taxes. The aggregates one, I think, was meant to come. There was some EU hold-up or something, but there could be some other areas. And again, borrowing powers, because it's a bit messy, the whole borrowing powers thing, and then with the new arrangements and so on, it could do with more clarification about the borrowing powers, I think.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Okay. John?
It was just, sorry, quickly around your comment, Professor, on borrowing powers. Was around almost, is that not essential that you do borrow if you're going to devolve tax?
Oh, yes.
To cope with fluctuations in tax take?
Yeah. Well, it is. It's just that there's about 3 or 4 different items in the current borrowing powers, and it's a bit confusing to follow them. And of course, Scotland, I think, has been given the power to issue bonds. That's the other alternative Now, I think that used again to be the case in Northern Ireland. There used to be Northern Ireland savings bonds, which the government ran, and it is up to government, say, to make money through giving people loans. It's a way of raising government money. It act like a bank, and I think that Scotland is going to be empowered to do that. The other side of borrowing, like the public-private partnerships, finance initiatives, they've got quite a bad press. You know, that's another way of doing it. But and again, Scotland's more or less stopped it because of that. So whether it's again, you have to look at the whole outcome, but it kind of fits into that area of increased borrowing.
Thank you.
Okay, John. Okay, Professor, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. So the stroke just about lasted out.
You did well. Thank you. Okay, members can seek agreement to publish Professor Burrell's evidence on the committee web pages to facilitate further written evidence for the review. Agreed. Moving on to DFP response to the committee's report on the draft budget. Refer members to the key recommendations from the committee report at pages 28 to 31 of your packs, and the DFP response at pages 12 to 23 of the table packs. Afternoon.
Afternoon.
We're just going to go straight to questions, if that's okay with yourselves.
Yeah, that's fine.
You sure?
Yes, positive.
Just the first point I want to raise is in terms of the lateness of the committee paper, because there has been agreed protocols in regard to this, but the briefing paper was due on Wednesday the 4th. It wasn't provided until 1:15 yesterday afternoon. What was the reason for that lateness?
Yeah, I mean, I can only apologise for the delay. We had to pull together responses from a number of different areas within DFP, and the time taken to do that and to give consideration to the responses and get an agreed position. Unfortunately, the timescale slipped, but I can only apologise, and it's definitely not ideal that you only got the response yesterday.
Okay. Just with reference to recommendation 3, this is page 14 of table of papers. Given that the budget is now in place since the 27th of January, what comment has the department on the overall economic impact of the budgetary reduction?
We've obviously commented on the overall impact of the public expenditure reductions. We have not yet progressed, especially with our work on the impact of the individual departmental decisions, because obviously the decisions taken by each individual minister will impact the overall effect on the economy, and we haven't yet progressed work on that to enable us to report on that.
Would it be fair to describe the department's response as a laissez-faire approach, and would a strategic assessment help inform the wider executive?
Well, I think we've given a strategic assessment in that where we expect the public expenditure to be positioned to be going over the coming years, and how we are facing significant reductions, and that we need to make decisions now in order to enable us to live within our constrained budget. As I say, work has not progressed beyond that, because we need the outworkings of what will be happening in the public sector restructuring and reform and within individual departments, because the decision those departments take will have an impact on where it affects.
In regard to recommendation 9, what level of oversight, including challenge and monitoring, will the department apply in relation to the other voluntary exit schemes across the public sector, and would this be important in terms of ensuring their overall success?
Yes, I think a level of oversight will be important. That work is being led by Public Sector Reform Division, so I'm going to ask Rachel to comment on that, if that's okay.
Yes, there's a steering group has been set up. It's chaired by the head of the civil service, and it includes representatives from across the departments and ALBs. And the role of that group is to oversee the entire VES process across the public sector. beyond DFP, and ourselves in Public Sector Reform Division are providing a secretariat to that group, and that will be important then in terms of rollout of that and the outworkings, and then the Transformation Fund itself in terms of allocating funding to the various departments. That group will report to the Executive and make recommendations to the Executive on the allocation of funds to the various departments and bodies.
And what kind of resource would be needed for that?
In terms of the actual group itself, Chair. And the group sits, they've had 2 meetings so far since January, and ourselves, our team already exists within Public Sector Reform Division already, so it's an additional resource at that level.
Okay. Any members, any questions? Leslie?
Yeah, just the 133 million, you know, for the pensions figure now reduced by about 10 million. In your response, you didn't really highlight why it wasn't flagged up a long time before it was. Why was that? All the discussions we had about pensions, for example, it was never mentioned.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, pensions is not our area of responsibility, but there had not been revaluations done on the pension schemes for a number of years, and it was only when that revaluation, I'm presuming when that revaluation was started, that they became aware there was going to be a significant pressure.
So that was not done until well into the pensions bill process?
Yeah,
Was it after it?
that actual revaluation was only finalised towards the end of January, start of February, I believe. So that's probably
After the whole exercise then?
Yes, past the post really, yes.
Just in relation to recommendation 12, and noting that to meet demand and assist development of this innovative methodology, a successful bid was made to the Change Fund, which will enable PSRD to run up to 20 labs in 2015, and this is page 19 of the table pack. What criteria is the Department applying for holding the innovation labs? How will they be evaluated, and how will implementation of any recommendations be monitored and reported on?
Again, I'll pass that on to Rachel.
Yeah, there are a number of labs scheduled now to take place in 15-16, and the Change Fund will allow that to take place. So that you've mentioned the additional 20 labs. The criteria will be dependent on the nature. At the moment, departments have come forward with ideas as to what those labs might entail. With the Change Fund, the criteria were those initiatives that were cross-cutting and collaborative, preventative in nature, and also innovative with a view to improving service delivery.
And when and on what basis will a decision be made on the expansion or the potential expansion of the Change Fund beyond 15-16?
I'm not sure at this stage. It will be dependent then on budgets then going forward in future years.
Yeah, I mean, that would be something that could be considered as part of the next budget process, and obviously depending on the outworkings of these allocations and the resources available.
In terms of recommendation 13 then, in regard to revenue raising and raising additional monies through charges, what is the timetable for assessment in terms of the range of additional taxes for devolution, and when does the Minister plan to go to the Executive with that?
I'm afraid I'm not aware of that. It's not our area that's taken forward that review, but I know work is ongoing on it, and I would expect to report soon, but I don't know an exact time scale. I don't know. It's not our area.
So you haven't heard anything at all about it?
No. To be honest, I haven't seen anything on it recently at all.
Okay. No problem. Any other questions, members? That'll be enough. Okay. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
It's always an advantage in coming in last.
I know.
Okay, members, can I seek agreement to publish the Department's response to the budget report on the committee's web pages alongside the committee report?
Agreed.
Moving on, SL1, the whole of government accounts designation of bodies, order NI 2015, pages 33 to 35 of your packs. The purpose of the draft order is to enable the Department to request information those departments and bodies designated and scheduled to the order, and to pass the information provided to Treasury for use in the preparation of the whole of government accounts, rules subject to negative resolution. I advise members that any queries or require further information, a departmental official is on standby and will come forward to address any queries. Do members have any queries in regard to this? No. If members are content with the proposals, put the question that the committee has considered DFP's proposal for subordinate legislation under SL1, the whole of government accounts designation of bodies order NI 2015, and has no objection to the policy implications of the proposed legislation at this stage. Agreed? Agreed. Okay, moving on, the Rates Social Sector Value Amendment Regs NI 2015, pages 36 to 41 of your packs. Thank you very much, Joanne. Okay. The SR has been laid in the Business Office by DFP for formal consideration, subject to negative resolution, and the statutory period expires on the 20th of April. At the meeting on the 21st of January, the committee was briefed by officials on the initial proposal. There have been no changes since that point. When members were content, Examiner Statutory Rules has no points about the rule by way of technical scrutiny, so members are content. Put the question the committee has considered SR 2015-82, the Rates Social Sector Value Amendment Regs NI 2015, and has no objection to the rule. Agreed? Rates Transitional Relief Order NI 2015, pages 43 to 50, subject to negative resolution, and statutory period expires 20th of April. At our meeting on the 21st of January, members were content. Department confirms no changes since. Examiner has no points to raise either. If members are content, put the question that the committee has considered SR 2015-83, the Rates Transitional Relief Order NI 2015, and has no objection to the rule. Agreed? Public Service Pensions Employer Cost Cap Regs NI 2015, pages 52 to 54, has been laid in the Business Office by DFP and subject to negative resolution, and the start period expires on the 20th of April. On the 14th of January, members were content. The Department confirms there has been no changes since that point. The Examiner has no points to raise either. So members are content, put the question. The committee has considered SR 2015-12, Public Service Pensions Employer Cost Cap Regs NI 2015, and has no objection to the rule. Agreed?
Agreed.
Correspondence?
Okay, Chair, just as usual, just pick out the items requiring decisions. First item is at page 56 of the pack. The OFMD-FM committee had written out to the various statutory committees asking for their views on the Children's Services Corporations Bill, which is a cross-cutting affects all departments. So DFP's this committee sought the view of the department. It's just writing back to say that it will affect the department, but it's still currently considering that. So it's just to seek agreement to forward that to as an interim response just to the OFMD-FM committee for information. Then there's a page 57. There's correspondence from the department, and it's providing an update in respect of the PSNI-NIO equal pay issue, which two other committees have been writing on this issue in recent times, the OFMD-FM committee and the Justice Committee, so as to seek information to forward the department's response to those two committees and to the original correspondent for information. Chair.
Agreed.
Then there's page 59 and also at page 28 of table pack, the department's writing in relation to the rate rebate replacement scheme, and is requesting to brief the committee on a proposal in terms of the way forward in that regard. So it's just to seek agreement to schedule a session in the work programme and also to copy the Social Development Committee, and again it's a cross-cutting issue for information.
Agreed.
And then there's correspondence at page 73 it's a response from DOJ relating to the issue of the level of bereavement damages. The issue had been raised by the Association of Professional Lawyers, the APIL, and the two responses have been sought, one from DOJ and one from DFP, so the DFP one's still pending, so it's just to seek agreement to copy both responses to the Association of Professional Injury Lawyers whenever that comes in.
Agreed.
Then There's also a request from DOJ at page 74 of the pack for briefing papers in relation to the family law, reform of family law issues that the committee had considered recently in terms of contact with children after separation. So it's just to seek agreement to forward those papers to DOJ for information as requested.
Agreed.
And that's all the correspondence requiring decisions, Chair.
Okay, committee work programme can refer members to correspondence from the Consumer Council regarding proposed stakeholder event on bank branch closures, and that's in pages 79 through to 85.
Yeah, just take a few moments, Chair, to speak to this item. Members will recall that the committee agreed in principle to sponsor a stakeholder event on bank branch closures on the proposal from the Consumer Council. Myself and Clarita and also the clerk of the ETI committee met with the Consumer Council officials to explore the options a bit further. And the Council has provided this paper setting out the proposal and what the purpose and the aims might be, and various stakeholders that could that they would see required to be brought together to discuss the issue. It's essentially around how both post offices and credit unions could assist in bridging the gap once banks decide to close branches, and how the various stakeholders could work together to try and leave a situation in those areas that can address the needs of local people, basically. So there's a proposal, and the date for that is being proposed in terms of getting accommodation in Parliament buildings would be Tuesday the 26th of May in the afternoon for about 2 hours for a round table stakeholder event, probably break into some groups and consider some issues. Also, just heard yesterday, the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee has agreed its report on banking, so that will be out on Monday of next week. So again, that would inform the discussions, and seeing the Consumer Council's paper there, as well as giving kind of a proposed format for the event and the stakeholders and the suggested issues that might be considered. There's also, in terms of the outcomes, desired outcome of the meeting, stimulate informed suggestions and debate on potential solutions, identify the viability of any solutions, and also importantly to obtain commitment from the banks and other stakeholders such as the Post Office and Credit Union to work together and to move the ideas forward through the creation of a steering group. So it would leave something in terms of, after the stakeholder event, there'd be some type of mechanism for implementing anything that was agreed. So it's just really to seek agreement, really, that in conjunction with the ETI committee, sponsor the event, which essentially means providing the room, and maybe it'd be tea and coffee in the afternoon. And
Up they're getting tea and coffee.
and
Michaela's
So coffee for visitors.
Well, not save 2 million.
Bearing in mind that would be quite a busy week if the committee decides to undertake a visit to Edinburgh on the Wednesday and Thursday, but there would be no meeting obviously that week if those decisions are made. Sure.
Okay, great. Just moving on to that visit.
Yes, so one of the dates that was discussed was the Wednesday the 27th and Thursday 28th, so it would be leaving for Edinburgh on Wednesday morning and back on Thursday evening. It's just to firm up a date because we need to work up a business case within the Secretariat for the visit. So
members content with that date then?
Yep.
2 dates talked about, Chair?
There was 2 dates.
We need to firm up on one.
The other date was a week before that, the Wednesday the 20th to the 21st. In terms of the 27th, with 5 members, 4 or 5 members, I think, at the moment, saying they're available for that date. So.
Probably now available. There was, I think it was one of those, and that's what I was trying to check out, one of those that was provisionally put in. But just got information that apparently it's now going to be, instead of May, it's going to be actually at some stage in June. So there's no particular clash in that regard.
I'd have probably preferred the week before, but
I'm relatively easy on either week, to be perfectly honest.
It's committee to decide.
What was the availability of members for the previous?
There was 3 members, I think, available the previous week on the 20th. So
May not get back.
and 5 for election.
I'll check mine today and come back to you.
I'll come back to forward work programme and PAC, so this afternoon, so just depending on business.
Okay, well, we want to try and wrap this up by the end of the day then, so if members can go back on availability. And can it be agreed that for the date that the majority of members suits, that we agree on that? And committee staff can
Probably
sign
suits
off
me
on that today. Okay, draft work programme, pages 86 to 88. Can I seek agreement that to assist in developing the programme from Easter to summer, the committee writes to the department seeking a summary from each business area of any forthcoming business, including, for example, any legislation, policy developments and monitoring round dates. Agreed? Any other business? Next meeting will be Wednesday the 18th of March at 10 a.m. sharp in room 30 in Parliament Buildings.
30.